Hi, everybody. My name is Rigo Gutierrez. I'm an MS4, and at McGovern Medical School. The title of our talk is Blink and You Might Miss It, Cultivating a Better Learning Environment. Apart from me, the other speakers are Dr. Emma Omori, Professor of Pediatrics, Dr. Amelia Guardiola, Professor of Pediatrics, myself, Maureen Sam, a third-year medical student, Andrea Hernandez, a third-year medical student, Luis Valdez, a second-year medical student, and Ashley Henderson, a second-year medical student. If you guys wouldn't mind taking the pre-survey, it's a few questions long, and you can type that link or use the camera function on your phone with the QR code, and it'll take you to the survey. And I'll give you guys a couple of minutes to complete that. Okay, does anybody need more time to complete the pre-survey? Okay, let's proceed. Thank you for doing that. So our objectives today, our first objective is to define microaggressions and how those microaggressions impact the student learning environment. Our second objective is to go through different examples of microaggressions that have been experienced by students throughout different interactive vignettes. Our third objective is to devise response strategies and also utilize proven strategies for responding to these situations. And lastly, come up with an action plan for preventing these situations in the future in the learning environment. We will be using Poll Everywhere throughout the session. So if you guys wouldn't mind going on your phone or on your browser to pollev.com/r Gutierrez 328. If anybody is having any difficulties, please speak up or let me know in the chat, please.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start this presentation by talking a little bit about microaggressions. Okay, and this is our first Poll Everywhere question. What comes to mind when you hear the word microaggressions? Anger, mean. Power, play. Hurting, okay. Unsure, okay. Unfair. Bias, okay. Yeah, thank you for sharing all of these words. Yeah, we see that bias is a common theme. Abuse. Okay, and now we will be moving on to explaining a little bit about what microaggressions are.
We think it's very important as we go through this workshop that we all have a common definition. So we want to go through the literature to help define microaggressions so that everybody's using the same working definition. So microaggressions are broadly defined, but they're typically behaviors that are ambiguously disempower racial and other minority groups. They're typically brief, subtle, you might miss, just like our presentation says, you might blink and you might miss them unless you've been the subject of a lot of microaggressions. They're typically nonverbal, but they send a negative message. And though they initially started off focused on racial groups and minority groups, we know that they can impact any marginalized group. So it's not limited to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, or disability. But you can imagine that these groups more often than not are feeling the negative impact of microaggressions. And especially if you have some sort of intersectionality between groups, you're going to be a target. So they were first defined actually by Dr. Su, who is a Harvard psychiatrist, and he had made note of the African-American Harvard students who were on the receiving end of what he noticed were subtle nonverbal slights by non-African-American Harvard students. So he came up with the term microaggressions, and he came up with 3 categories thus forth. So microassaults, they're explicit, so they can be physical, verbal, or nonverbal acts of racism or discrimination that communicate to the targeted party that they're of lesser worth. Micro insults are messages that are insensitive and disparaging to a person's racial identity or background, and once again imply that the minority did not earn their position. And you can imagine if you already have some sort of stereotype threat, how this can compound it. And then micro invalidations. These are behaviors that negate, neutralize, or deny the experience of people of color. I don't see color. We're all colorblind in my family. We're all the same, and I wish we would all realize that. So once again, they're unconscious learned ideology. And so that's why we're having this workshop, because anything that can be learned can be modified. And they provide an opportunity to discuss the various forms of oppression that infiltrate our thoughts and behaviors. So we're going to talk about the impact because, as you guys see, this is being run by students, and it does negatively impact a student's experience in the learning environment. So there's a psycho-emotional impact. So each individual microaggression that is experienced usually is in the context of past racism. So once again, if you're from a marginalized group, I'm a pediatrician, and we know that children as young as 3 are aware of their stratification racially in the society. And so you can see how these can potentially compound on each other. There's a social impact. So a 2013 study from Harper noted that being the only minority student makes it easier for the student to be identified as different. And then obviously there's the scrutiny that is placed on them by the outside, but then also the scrutiny that they place on themselves of having to be the model person, break all stereotypes that may exist for their potential group. And this leaves them vulnerable. And once again, why we're focusing on this, because it does have an impact on learning outcomes. This study was more recent from 2019. We know that repetitive mistreatment during training leads to negative emotional and physical repercussions, decreased work performance, and ethical distress. So we're I'm a pediatrician, the rest of the presenters are medical students. In any of our health science schools, we know it's a heightened stress for many of these students. So you already have the stress from their schoolwork, and then you're putting other things on top of it. And you can imagine the impact it might have on learning outcomes and also performance. We also know that microaggressions committed against people early in their journey of professional identity formation compound. And so they can have a larger negative impact, especially when they continue to go on in their physician career.
So now that we all have an understanding of what microaggressions are and the impact that they can have, we're going to go through several vignettes that depict microaggressions from the student perspective and see the impact directly. You'll have the opportunity to practice and reflect on how you would address these situations. Towards the end of our presentation, we'll look at some best practice strategies that you can use in the future to help you combat microaggressions when they occur.
So our first vignette, Mark is getting ready to leave the clinic when he runs into 2 of his classmates, Devante and Cindy. Since he hadn't talked to them in a while, he decides to have a quick conversation with them on his way out. "How's y'all's day?" he asks. "This morning I was driving to class and I didn't realize I had left my badge at home until halfway through my commute. I had to drive back and ended up getting here late," says Cindy. "Wow, you're so retarded sometimes," says Mark. After hearing this, Devante became visibly uncomfortable, said goodbye to Mark and Cindy, and walked the other way. Mark and Cindy don't know this, but one of Devante's younger siblings suffers from mental retardation. So this is again another poll everywhere question. Let's say you overheard this conversation and you, Mark and Cindy and Devante. How would you address this situation? Okay, say that word is not used anymore. Not sure what I would do. Ask Cindy why she chose that word. Okay. Apologize in private. Pull Mark aside. Oh yes, and that's another feature. You can go ahead and agree with any of the responses that have already been submitted. Okay. Thank you for your responses. Yeah, checking in with Devante, seeing how he feels. Okay, here's another question. Oh, we went back. Okay. Would you have done something about this had you not known about Devante's sibling? Why or why not? And just keep in mind, these questions are just to get us thinking and to kind of have like our first reaction to these type of vignettes. As Maureen mentioned, we will go over how to appropriately address things at the end. Yeah, I would have chosen the words better. You see, probably not. Yes, because using retarded is not acceptable word. Okay, thank you for your responses. And another question, what are other examples of words that tend to be used colloquially to be but can be offensive to other groups? Gay. Oriental. Ghetto. Fat, midget. Did you shoot someone down? Stupid. Cracker. Right, thank you for your responses. Mexican as a term for all Hispanics. Yeah, thank you.
All right, so a faculty member is facilitating a virtual meeting with medical students in which they're discussing how they're preparing for upcoming exams and things they like to do in their free time to relax. Jamal, one of the medical students, asked his classmates if they wanted to have a socially distanced event after their upcoming exam to celebrate and be done with the semester. Daniel, one of the students on the meeting who happens to be Japanese, suggests going to the park and having a distance picnic. Nor, another classmate, says jokingly, if Daniel is going to the event, then I'm not going. I don't want to catch the Chinese virus from him. Some of the students that were unmuted laughed at the comment, and someone else in the group asked if anyone has any other ideas. Most of the attendees had their cameras turned off during the meeting, including Daniel and Noor. What would you do in this situation? Private message and apologies. That's why somebody made that comment. Disinvite Nor. Point out it's not a Chinese virus. Send a message in the main chat about being considerate. Okay, so addressing the whole group. That's good. Okay, this is not a place I expected to hear that phrase. Hurtfulness of the comment. Culturally sensitive comment, yes. Okay, we can go on to our next question. How could you, as a facilitator, could have prevented something like this from happening in the future? Not sure. Okay, someone says set clear ground rules up front with the students. I like that you guys are using those, the liking feature. That also lets us know, even though not everybody might be putting in a comment, you guys are helping decide or move comments up and down in here. Yeah, address the group immediately. Teach the class about cultural awareness topics. That's a great answer. Discussing it, always better, right, than to hide it or not talk about it in a kind way. Okay, these are all great answers. We can go ahead and move on to the next question. Do you feel that being in a virtual setting makes comments like these easier or harder to say? Yeah, this is something to think about as we adjust to the COVID-19 pandemic and virtual learning. Good answer is harder. We see a split. Depends on the participants know each other. Good. All right, we can move on to the next one. Next case. So we have Ellen, who is shadowing Dr. Williams at a family medicine clinic when they encounter Olivia, a 34-year-old woman who comes to the clinic for the first time to establish care. She's accompanied by her wife. Dr. Williams takes a thorough social, family, and medical history, given that this is Olivia's first visit. While asking her about her social history, he asks Olivia if she had a husband. Olivia looks confused given that her wife was sitting right next to her and had been holding hands this whole time. She says, "No, but I have a wife." Dr. Williams apologizes for the mistake and adds the information to her chart. Later in the day, Dr. Williams sees another new patient and does the same thorough interview. The new patient is a male, and when Dr. Williams got to the social history, he asked if he had a wife. This patient answers yes, and they continue with the encounter. If you were Dr. Williams, how would you respond to Ellen, the medical student who's shadowing you, if she pointed out this unconscious bias? Embarrassed, not a big deal. Awkward. Apologize. Apologize immediately. Acknowledge that I should have seen what was obvious. Use partner next time. So that's good. Finding an alternative, a neutral alternative, that's good. Thank them for pointing it out. Try to be mindful. Good responses. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question. How does the power differential affect how this scenario is addressed? Again, in this scenario, it is a medical student and a physician, a practicing physician. Decision has no power, makes it tough. Scared to death of senior doctors. Yes, I can attest to that. Awkward for the student. Power dynamics, yes. All great responses. Take a lot of courage to speak up. The student may be very reluctant. Yes. Okay, we can go ahead and move on to the next question. Ellen approaches you for advice about how to address this situation. What advice would you give Ellen? So now you're not Dr. Williams, but you're a third party. How would you address this? What advice would you give Ellen? Offer assistance, state relationship, talk to a more senior person who is likely to be her ally. Someone at the school for help. Use the word spouse instead of husband and wife. That will be for Dr. Williams. Help her navigate the situation given that dynamic differential. Yes, good answer. It depends on what kind of person Dr. Williams is, right? We don't know what their reaction will be to being approached and confronted in a way about this situation. Proceed cautiously. Good answers, good responses.
Actually, we can hear you. I'm sorry. It's Dr. Guardiola.
Good. Okay, great. Sorry about that, guys. So you're the faculty facilitating a small group session with a colleague. You begin the session by having everyone do an introduction, stating their preferred name and a fun fact. Following your introduction, one by one, the students begin to introduce themselves. Hello, I'm Michael Bates, and I love baking. Hello, I'm Maria Fernandez, and I love bird watching. Hello, I'm Joshua Adams, and I love playing tennis in my free time. Hello, I'm Omolola Ajuwale, and I like to paint in my free time. Your colleague looks at Omolola and asks her, do you have a nickname? Because I won't be able to pronounce that. You look over to examine the reaction of the student and observe that she seems a bit bothered, and she shook her head no. Throughout the remainder of the session, you notice the student remained quiet for most of the session. Now, as a primary facilitator, what would you do to make the student not feel excluded throughout the session? Say her name correctly. Yes, if possible, it would be a great idea. I frequently call on her and very obviously use her name. Make her feel comfortable. That's good. Learn to pronounce the name. That's important. Apologize and try to say the name correctly. Pronounce her name and highlight it. It's nice. Great. And never be afraid to ask for help if you're unable or feel uncomfortable with saying someone's name. These are all good responses. Next question. So, is it appropriate to comment on a student's accent or name pronunciation? What do you think? No. No. Okay, there's a lot of no's. Okay. Yes, if it's a positive comment. For example, what a beautiful name. If it comes from a good place. How do we define a good place? Maybe out of curiosity. Okay. Yes, it's tricky. I have an accent, so I volunteer info about myself first. This is great. Next slide. Now, can you describe a time in which you've encountered a familiar experience? Whether it's you, the person who may have been called out for a pronunciation of your name or an accent, or whether you were the individual who addressed someone's pronunciation of their name or their accent. I'm sorry. Every day. Introducing awards. That can be very challenging. Roll call can be very challenging as well. Where are you from? Oh, your last name must be French. It's Turkish. Of course it is. Where'd you get that from? I like that. I'm sure I've done it to someone. If I am being honest, I'm pretty sure I've done it to someone too. I always mispronounce and it has 4 letters. My name's Ashley. Everyone has this name. This one sounds every day. Wow. Okay, so we're all in this together. I mispronounce others' names many times, or call them guy or girl to avoid using their name. Okay. Next slide.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to the portion of our presentation where we're going to talk about some strategies and what we can do to kind of deal with these microaggressions and how to address them. Okay, so essentially there's 3 ways you can respond to this situation. The first be to let it go. It sometimes can be emotionally draining to respond to some of these situations, both for someone on the outside looking in or someone being who is actually experiencing these things. And the other side of that is that silence can be very taxing. Our other option would be to respond immediately in that moment. So immediacy would be important because, well, it's an important component of correcting the bad behavior. It happened right in that second and you can address it right at that time. But this is a risky thing to do because then the person who is the perpetrator can get defensive and that can quickly turn into a non-productive conversation. And then there's always the option to respond later. Now, this can be challenging because you will have to get the person to recall the incident and appreciate the impact of it because they're no longer in that moment and they may not remember exactly what happened. And at the same time, there's also a drawback because if you did hold on to it, it might seem like you are a little bit too, as some say, like dramatic, or you're just holding on to things or holding a grudge. So like it says on that last line, it might seem like you're holding on to the incident or harboring resentment. And so when choosing how to go about the situation, it's important to discern. And so things to think about are how important like the issue and like the subject of the microaggression was and your relationship to that person. If both of those things are important, then it would be best to address it and do it in a way that acknowledges your concern about the issue. It's important to reflect on your feelings. Sometimes these microaggressions can make you doubt the legitimacy of your reactions. Like I said, sometimes it can, if you hold on to it for a long time, you might feel like, am I being dramatic or things like that. They can also cause you to have really strong negative emotions. And this one is important. If you're confused about what happened, it might be best to address it right then and there, just to get clarification. And if you are just exhausted with it and you're like, this happens all the time, I can't even put my energy into it, then of course, let it go, but only if you want to. And the last thing to consider, which I know as students who are presenting this now have definitely dealt with this, how you want to be perceived now and in the future. Just acknowledging that the consequences of both speaking up versus remaining silent.
Okay, so Andrea just talked about moments of when you could address it or when you wouldn't, like versus in the moment or after the fact. But the bottom line is that it's important that we equip ourselves with ways to respond so that we're not stuck or putting anyone in the defensive when these moments do happen. One way that we can do this is through the action communication tool. Please take a moment to use the URL link or scan the QR code so that you have access to it. Please keep it open because we're going to use it for our last vignette. And I'm going to drop the link here as well and give you a moment to pull it up before we move on. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so the first part of action is the A. It tells us to begin by asking a clarifying question. So this allows you to make sure you're on the same page about what was said, and it'll better help you understand their intentions. The C reminds us to always be curious. So during your conversation, you want to keep an open mind by listening to what they're saying instead of just jumping to your own conclusions. T is for telling them what you've witnessed. Keep it neutral by sharing only objective information. This prevents it from becoming emotional and just by stating the facts. The I in action is for impact exploration. So help them see how their comments or their behavior may have impacted the target of the microaggression, as well as those who witnessed it. The O is for owning your thoughts and your feelings around the impact. You can do this by sharing how it made you feel or by discussing how you think it might have affected others. And then the N is for next steps. So it's going to vary depending on the situation, but it's important that people walk away not to do in the future. It's also important that we close the loop and reach out to those who are impacted if we think it's appropriate. So now we're going to look at vignette 5, and we'll see how we could respond using the action tool. So you're sitting in the lecture hall waiting for your colleague to complete their lecture. You observe a student walk in from the back door and take a seat silently. Your colleague stops the lecture and says, "Are you people always late? Please be professional or do not enter the classroom." You overhear another student nearby say, "The professor better be careful before her family blows up the house." And you hear the surrounding students begin to laugh. Then the student picked up her belongings and stormed out the room. You quickly and silently step out of the classroom to consult the student, and you see that her hijab is drenched in tears. So assuming you're the student, assuming you're the one addressing the student in the vignette, how well do you think these talking points here on our slide address the action tool? So here you see several responses that you could use as talking points during a conversation. So we see you could say something along the lines of, "Before we leave, I want to point out what just happened. I don't think you're aware of what you just said. It's inappropriate to make jokes like that, and it's hurtful. In the future, please refrain from making those types of comments." So on our next slide, using our poll everywhere, let us know how you think these address the action tool and provide examples. Feel free to also tell us what you like or dislike about it. And if we need to go back so that you can see the responses, let us know as well. Okay, so I think it's appropriate to use those responses. Okay, someone else also agrees with that? Are there things that we would add or change to the responses that we saw? Keeping in mind what action stands for. So remember, A is for asking clarifying questions, C, remaining curious, T, telling them what you've heard or observed, the impact, owning how you feel or how others may feel, and next steps. Do we think all of that was addressed? And Louise has also put the responses in the chat box so that you can take a look and compare. Okay, so someone said, "Or now, why would you say that she in particular would have her family blow up his house?" So that's another clarifying question so that you can see what their thought process is. Okay, then someone else is saying that we left some things out. So addressing the C, T, O, and N part of action. And then I see that someone also said you could state how you feel. Okay, and then also someone's saying, so after you have this conversation with the student, or while you're having this conversation with the student, asking them how you think you made her feel. Okay, do we want to add anything else? Okay, someone said, consider asking why the student was late. Okay, so these are all really good responses. Let's look at another version of how we could have responded and compare that to action, as well as add anything else. Okay, so response 2. So here are the talking points for the same scenario. So I think I heard you say the professor could be blown up. Help me understand what you meant by that. I'm not sure if you noticed, but your classmate left in tears. Think about how that comment can perpetuate negative stereotypes. It would be good if you reached out to your classmate to address this. On our next slide, let us know how you feel responses. Think about how it correlates to the action tool. And feel free to discuss if you think that this is a better response compared to the first one. Okay, so someone's saying, I like the clarifying question because it makes the student think about where the thought even came from. Okay, someone's saying that the first response is better, it's stronger. Okay, someone else is saying, I like the response, it helped me understand. I'm saying some people would appreciate reaching out to the student and some others would rather forget about the incident. Okay. And the response was better in regards to addressing the students, but not the professor. Okay, so I like what I'm seeing. So some of us think that the first response is probably a better way to address the situation. Some feel that the second response may be better. I do agree that none of the responses looked at the professor's behavior in relation to the students. But one thing that I will say, just like Andrea mentioned earlier, just as it's important to think about what you are going to say, it's very important that we always address a microaggression. Research does show that the impact of not addressing what happened is just as harmful as having it happen to you to begin with. And I think it's important to remember that sometimes, depending on the microaggression, you may have a sense of privilege in that situation. And so to be an ally and to help create a safer environment for all of us, even though it's uncomfortable, try to take the steps to come up with a way of how you would respond. Before we move on, is there anything else that someone would like to share about how they would respond to this situation, either by unmuting or in the chat box? Okay, thank you guys for your responses.
Okay, now some things to remember. So as an ally and, being faculty and being in a position of power within like our own UT institution, remember that the intent does not supersede impact. Therefore, just because you didn't mean something in a bad way doesn't mean that that makes it okay that the person is like, that you said what you said and now the person is upset. And also seek to understand the experiences of your minority students, peers, bosses, and employees without making them responsible for your edification. Oftentimes, you hear about like this diversity or minority tax of having to constantly explain all these like different concepts to people that are in positions of privilege. And, while it is okay to come from a place of curiosity, it's also okay to really like find your own ways of doing that research and putting that work on yourself. Believe your minority colleagues when they choose to share their insights. Don't get defensive or play devil's advocate in these situations. Get comfortable rethinking much of what you thought to be true about the world and your workplace, and accept that you have likely been complicit in producing inequity. I like the response in the poll everywhere that said, I'm sure I've done it to someone else in the past. Just acknowledging that gets you in the right direction to kind of explore that a little bit more. Okay, and so what are some ways you plan to implement change in your learning spaces after being in this workshop and kind of having these conversations with us? Yeah, being more aware. Pay more attention to conversations, yeah, and the impact that they're having on like students. Yeah, okay, and that's the thing, being more aware, learning that some of these things that we discussed today are microaggressions now, you know, that could help tremendously in like bettering the learning environment. Practice mindfulness, plan for better engagement with students, address microaggressions right away. Being ready to say something when I notice it happening. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think that was the intention behind this whole presentation is just bringing a lot of these things to light. As we had said in the beginning, a lot of these things are unconscious and it kind of just like happens and they're said, but they do have a really negative impact in the learning environment. So thank you for all these responses. That's really encouraging and it makes us feel like, you know, we've helped to kind of create some progress here. Are there any questions or comments?
And also feel free to use the chat function or to unmute yourself if there are questions, comments, clarifications, anything else that would be helpful for you moving forward.
Hi, this is Elisa Winkler. I still would like to get more feedback about how to deal with not knowing how to pronounce somebody's name in situations where I haven't had an opportunity to learn how to pronounce it correctly. I feel very awkward. I mean, I don't want to just address, I like to address students by name, but I feel very awkward, you know, being comfortable with some names and not others. What I've generally done is ask them how to pronounce it, but I don't know if that's considered, you know, inappropriate. So love more suggestions.
Go ahead, Maureen.
One thing that I did, and I think this could work in any classroom situation. So if you're in, I guess if you're in a small group setting, one thing that you could do, like TBLs or PBLs, have everyone go around the room and introduce themselves, like say an interesting fact, and that's one way to create a welcoming environment for everyone. And at the same time, you're getting to learn names before you have to figure out how to say the name. So that's one suggestion.
That's
good. Can I add something? Can I add something there?
Yeah.
In my 40 years in the classroom, I have dealt almost exclusively with non-native speakers of English. I've been confronted with people's names from, you know, I mean, more countries than you can imagine. And I believe it is always appropriate to ask somebody, tell me how to pronounce your name, and then you pronounce it right afterwards. And you kind of apologize because you're never going to be able to pronounce it absolutely correctly. My first name is Mark, which is a really easy thing to pronounce for an English speaker. It is almost impossible for anybody from any other language because it has an AR followed by a consonant. You know, if I'm going to get upset because my students can't pronounce my first name or my last name, which is just 5 letters, P-I-C-U-S, I bet you have no idea how to pronounce that, right? Because it's an ancient Polish name, which has been anglicized on Ellis Island. It's Picus. I don't get upset when my students mispronounce my name, but I will quietly correct them. And if they never get it, if they never pronounce it correctly, I have worse things to worry about with my students, but I try very hard to pronounce it correctly. My Chinese students, of which I have, you know, thousands of them, often compliment me on how well I pronounce their names just by seeing it written in the pinyin system. And I know it does not sound like I'm speaking Chinese. So don't beat yourself up. You're never going to pronounce it correctly, but make the effort, because, you know, think how you feel when someone makes that effort towards you.
Mhm.
It's to be appreciated.
Yeah, I would agree. I like my name to be pronounced the way it's meant to be pronounced, like in Spanish, Andrea. And so often my faculty will ask me like, oh, wait, how do you want me to pronounce your name? And even in English, they'll be like, is it Andrea or Andrea? And I'm like, neither. Let me just show you how to pronounce it. And even if it's not perfect, I'm not offended by that. I really appreciate when they try and when they even took the time to really respect my name and respect where it came from and just put that effort in. So like I think Mark said, as long as you put the effort in, I don't think anyone would fault you for mispronouncing it. But just knowing that you acknowledged it and you are coming from a place of wanting to better the environment for that person is all we could ask for.
Thank you, everyone.
This is Amalia, Dr. Guardiola. I have to actually get you guys to see the chat box, because I think they are talking about the same thing, that at least if we respect other people's name and do the effort, we should be, that's better than just keep mispronouncing it. One thing, so personally, I'm from Puerto Rico, so my first language is Spanish. I do roll my R's, but I don't pronounce other things. So actually, what has helped me, Elisa, in the past is when I have difficult names for me to pronounce, I will ask the student to repeat the name to me. And then on a piece of paper, I write it like I will say it, like phonetically. So I keep reminding myself of how to pronounce it, and then eventually, I'll get it. But I think my students have appreciated when I ask them, how do I pronounce your name? How do you want me to call you, etc. I think it's a sign of respect.
Are there any other questions or need for clarification? Okay, Maureen just posted the link for our post survey. And if Rigo, could you go to the next slide, please? Actually, I'm not sure if it's working.
Let me reference it. We do have that QR code that gives you easy access. So if anybody wants that information, this is a great way to obtain it.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming to our session. We hope that this was helpful for everyone and that you learned something. Like Dr. Guardiola said on our previous slide, we did have references so that if you want to learn more about microaggressions and how you can address them, there are all of our resources that we used to create the session. To better help us improve for the future, please complete our post survey so that we can see if your attitudes and understanding about microaggressions changed, as well as your ability to be able to respond.